Okay, continuing, I'm still talking about the Canaanites, and I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about some other specifics that are interesting in regards to these people that I found through various sources. I've already spent a great deal of time drawing a very descriptive picture of what these people are like, and that they were a warlike, very violent group of people. And in the last two videos, spent some time describing their religious practices, which included child sacrifice, bestiality, incest, homosexuality, and cultic prostitution. Now, in discussing the Canaanites, I ran across quite a bit of information. One piece of information that I came across that I found interesting is that the Canaanites had a bad reputation already around the time of Abraham. In surveying historical mentions of the name Canaan, scholars point out that the mention of the very name occurs in a derogatory context oftentimes. This is according to the peoples of the Old Testament. Quoting an 18th-century letter from Marie provides the next evidence for the name in a phrase that connects thieves and Canaanites. A textual piece of data to support this cheat understanding might be the actions of the Hittite group in Genesis 23. Remember, in Genesis 23, Abraham's wife has died and he's trying to buy a burial field. Ephraim the Hittite takes advantage of Abram's grief and need to secure burial property quickly and charges him an incredible, exorbitant 400 shekels of silver for the field. That's according to Jeremiah 32:9, and saddles him with the property taxes and dues that went with the whole lot land ownership. Keep in mind, Abraham only wanted to buy a cave, not the whole field. And this was typical of the merchant ethic of the Canaanites. Of course, then there's no wonder why they were grouped in with thieves. At the time of Jacob, the Hittites had some interaction with the Hebrews. One of the Hittite leaders raped Dinah, a daughter of Jacob, in Genesis 34, and tried to accumulate all of Jacob's possessions. At the time of Moses, Israel is trying to march through Transjordan on the neutral king's highway. They peacefully approach the king of the Amorites with a standard pass-through request, but is met with abject hostility and an unprovoked attack with his entire army on Israel. The encounter is narrated in Numbers 21:21. Notice that the Amorites had taken this territory from Moab by force already, according to Numbers 21:26. We also know that Canaan, between the times of Abraham and Joshua, roughly were basically synonymous with Egypt's territory in Palestine. That's according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Thus, the general picture that emerges from the scattered data is remarkably consistent. Consistent Canaan is in general name for the Asian holdings of Egypt. Again, that's from the peoples of the Old Testament. As such, they would have known quickly about the Exodus victory, Joshua chapter 2 verses 8 through 11, and had an interest in subjecting or destroying Israel for the Pharaoh. So even the additional available data supports a very negative and abusive view of the Canaanites and Amorites and the rest that lived in that land that Israel was marching into. They also had a long exposure to truth and influences to moderation, even though they obviously did not heed them at all. We've seen from previous videos that Canaan drew heavily from the pure stock of the Ebionite theology and culture. This would have been a long-term influence to moderation. The outstanding figure of Melchizedek ministered right in the middle of them during the times of Abraham and may have been an Amorite himself. The story is given in Genesis 14. He's the priest king of Salem, which is now Jerusalem, and imparts additional theological knowledge to Abraham. What is interesting is that he was right in the middle of the Amorite presence and would have been quite a beacon to those people. But what is also very intriguing is the notion that he would quite possibly have been an Amorite himself. In Ezekiel 16:3, the prophet rebukes the Jebusites of Jerusalem with these words, that this is what the sovereign Lord says to Jerusalem: your ancestry and birth were in the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. And again in 16:45, this would argue that Melchizedek was either an Amorite or a Hittite. Abraham also lived among these peoples and had close relationships with the Amorites and the Hittites, Genesis 14 and Genesis 23. Esau actually married Hittite wives or women, also called Canaanites, but this was a bad experience for the family, according to Genesis chapter 26 and 27. So there would have been numerous points of contact in generally friendly settings, but in which worldviews would have been discussed. Of special significance would have been the words of Melchizedek upon the victory by Abraham and his Amorite allies, Genesis 14:18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. He blessed Abraham, saying, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." This statement that God had fought for Abraham is such a victory of striking proportions would surely have registered with the Amorite companions, Genesis 14:13, and had been remembered in their legends. The Canaanites, Amorites would have witnessed God's judgment in Sodom and the cities of the plain. Abraham had delivered those cities from a Mesopotamian king in Genesis 14, and perhaps the Amorite cities in verse 7, only to see them destroyed in Genesis 19. Abraham and Lot were witnesses of the theological understanding of the highly visible and internationally applauded, no doubt, action by God. The people's land had taken notice and warning. The things that I've just mentioned were 400 years plus before the judgment of them began. So they had plenty of warning of how they were supposed to behave and how they were supposed to act. During the 400 years in Egypt, the Canaanites would have had much interaction with Egypt, much of which probably went through Goshen and the place of the Hebrews, and they were probably in constant contact with Joseph and the tribes during the early famine years, and it is likely that the Egyptian influence in Palestine was expanded during this commercial interaction. During the 400 years, the Canaanites would have still been surrounded by offspring of Abraham through Ishmael and Esau, not to mention that of Lot. The nations of Moab, Ammon, Edom would have preserved early traditions about Elohim for exchange with nations. Immediately after the Exodus, word got out about the Hebrews and how Israel made its way into Canaan. In Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, Rahab had heard about the Exodus some 40 years earlier, the conquest of the Amorite kings a few months earlier in the land grant promised by Yahweh given 400 years earlier. They probably had at least 40 years of notice of Israel's coming. Remember that Amalek knew of the Exodus within days and attacked Israel. Likewise, after drying up of the Jordan before the fall of Jericho, the whole land of Palestine knew, and the individuals would have begun migrating as common in those days. So Joshua 5:1, there was abundance of information for these people, perhaps even more than the other nations around them had, and they did not. But they did not respond appropriately. The other nations in ancient Near East seemed to respond to available truth with a degree of moderation, and correspondingly did not develop the ruthless, cruel, and degenerate practices of their Canaanite neighbors. The summary is this: the nations show up in archaeology and literature as a uniquely evil and destructive civilization, whose culpability is increased due to the abundance of truth and religious warnings which they were confronted with and had access to. In contrast to the vast majority of surrounding nations, the Canaanite Amorite cultures would not act responsibly or prudently in matters of foreign relations or domestic practice. The result was a destructive and malignant force in an already difficult ancient Near Eastern historical setting. And I'll pick this up in the next video.